So, good afternoon, good morning, and of course, on Mainuddin, it's good evening. And uh, welcome to all. I welcome all the speakers, panelists, and the audience, who is, of course, joining all virtually to this sixth and the last in the series of SDC IMI solar webinar series that really started on the 1st of February on the Monday this week. And it is as a part of our ongoing project on solar irrigation for agricultural resilience in South Asia. The first of the series of the webinar, which was there on the first, started off with the role of solar irrigation pumps, what we call shortly as SIPs, in clean energy transition in South Asia. And that was followed by four country presentations from India, Nepal, Bangladesh, and Pakistan. And so, as I said, this is the last in the series. And in this sixth webinar, which is the final in the series, we'll be largely discussing ways of managing solar irrigation pumps and programs and policies in a way that does not lead to further groundwater overexploitation in the region. And the context, I guess we all are pretty much aware, because the South Asia, as we all know, is the largest user of groundwater. And we also know the fact that the groundwater tables have been declining pretty fast, aquifers are depleting, and the climate change is further adding another element to it. And we have also seen in the past, and the studies have pretty much evidence that energy pricing plays an important role in determining the farmer's pumping behavior. And now with the solar coming up, so while upfront cost of solar irrigation pumps are high, running cost is virtually zero, and that gives us a rise to the widespread apprehension that the SIPs may promote groundwater overexploitation. And especially, it's a matter of concern if it is so in the scarce parts of the South Asia, where the groundwater is fast depleting. So with that kind of things in the view, this particular webinar has been proposed to really answer certain questions. So what is the current state of evidence on impact of SIPs on groundwater pumping? Is groundwater overexploitation really a serious concern everywhere? Perhaps may not be, because it depends where we are situated into. And is it inevitable that SIPs will lead to groundwater overexploitation, or is it possible to design SIP programs in ways that it provides incentives to the farmers in trying to see that how best we can incentivize and reduce the groundwater over exploitation? So with these set of questions, what we are really trying to be looking into is that how best we can answer some of these really burning questions, because we have seen that over the past 5 webinars which we have had, there was overwhelming response of people asking about these particular questions. Now, in this case, what is there that we have a sea of eminent speakers and the panelists who are there with us, and you all, the audience, can see it on their screens. So I'll try and introduce one by one the speakers and then subsequently the panelists. So the first speaker on this series is Dr. Veena Srinivasan, and she is with ATRI and in Bangalore, and she will be presenting her presentation, and she'll be speaking about the overall groundwater crisis in India, particularly with reference to the South Asia, and also provide a typology based on relative abundance and scarcity of water and energy, and how different policies will be needed in different water energy typologies. Then we have The next speaker is Dr. Meha Jain, and Meha will be walking us through the impact of climate change on groundwater and further impact on groundwater over abstraction on agriculture. Then we have the next in the line is Dr. Mainuddin, who is with the CSIRO and our ex-IMI colleague. And he will be talking about the volumes of groundwater extraction from electric and the diesel pumps in Bangladesh and whether field scale water management can save water at the basin level or not, and what are those kind of situations. And he will also try and explore his findings to shed some light on the impact of SIPs on groundwater, particularly with reference to Bangladesh. That would be followed by a presentation by Dr. Wolfgang, and Wolfgang will be making his PowerPoint presentation and speaking about how the electricity can be used as a proxy for measuring volume of groundwater extraction, and he will be illustrating it with the case studies which they are doing in China, in trying to see that how best we can try and interpolate or try and make an assessment of the making use of the energy as a surrogate measure for trying to look at the groundwater depletion. And the final presentation is by none other than our ex-colleague, Dr. Tushaar Shah, who is the IMI Emeritus Scientist. And he will be talking about the IMI's experiment, which is quite well known about Dhundi and also the sky feeders, in trying to see that how the incentivization has helped or is helping in saving groundwater conservation. And then we have, in addition to Tushaar, two other colleagues joining us as a panelist. One is Simi Kamal, who is from Pakistan, and also Anwar Zahid from Bangladesh. So I welcome all the panelists and all the speakers. And now with this thing, I would like to just get on with this further proceedings. Now, as we move on, I'll come back to the panelist, that what we expect from the panelist is that once you have heard about these presentations, that we would like to know from you that where you situate yourself and in your country about their presentations, to make some certain points and observations on their presentations, and also what you think we can do to ensure that SIPs do not accelerate the current groundwater crisis, and particularly what are the different options, both policy prescriptions as well as the field level options, particularly with reference to your country or in general. So I think I'll leave it over here and now have a, I would like to, before I invite, I think I would like to invite the first speaker, which is of the day, that is Dr. Veena Srinivasan. Veena, could you please share your screen?
Thank you so much, Dr. Sikka.
And you all have 12 minutes.
So firstly, thank you for inviting me. Really exciting topic. And this is part of a larger conversation we've been having with India Climate Collaborative as well. The question that comes up over and over again across not just solar irrigation, but with all sorts of water security interventions is this what I call the what works, where and why question. And so we thought that we would try to address this question using a framework. I wasn't planning to do solar irrigation, but when Aditi approached me to give this talk, we thought, well, why don't we use solar irrigation as one of our cases? And so we're trying to work, it's work in progress, but it's a framework that I hope to present today. I think that there's nobody here who doesn't understand that India faces a groundwater crisis. But it's valuable to kind of frame it as what I call the Goldilocks problem, which is that we have a groundwater crisis, which simultaneously is one of groundwater exploitation, where too much irrigation is resulting in groundwater depletion, but also groundwater poverty situation where a very large fraction of our farmers remain rain-fed. They don't have access to protective irrigation, and therefore their income is very low. So if you just looked at it in a very, very simplistic way, just comparing rainfall to potential evapotranspiration, and I took a hypothetical crop of 3 vegetable crops in a place like Bangalore, clearly there's India's rainfall is seasonal, and there's a large part of the year where we don't have access to water, and which is why what ends up happening is if you don't have access to irrigation, you would end up growing typically a rain-fed millet type crop or a rain-fed pulses crop, and incomes tend to be fairly low in terms of acres per year. If, on the other hand, at the other end of the scale, the farmer was choosing to grow irrigated double paddy under those same circumstances, there would be a large fraction of the year where the potential evapotranspiration of the crop would exceed what exceed available rainfall, which would require substantial amount of irrigation. And this, of course, then leads to much higher incomes per year. And so basically, access to irrigation moves farmers, helps farmers escape from poverty. I think everybody understands this basic framing. Now, of course, because of irrigation, it has indeed allowed farmers, a very large fraction of farmers, to escape poverty. But at the same time, groundwater abstraction has increased very substantially. And all of us have seen these alarming figures by Central Groundwater Board, which show a very large number of blocks in India as being critical or overexploited. At the same time, in spite of this increase and in spite of the groundwater depletion, farm and rural wages have remained stagnant or declining, and farmer suicides haven't really, there hasn't been a downturn in farmer suicides over the last 25 years. So I think we all understand the basic argument that we're investing a lot, whether through Manrega or whether through Jal Shakti, various schemes of the Ministry of Water Resources. But either we are not doing things enough or we are not doing the right things. And I think the aggregate indicators remain alarming despite the sector investments. So the question then becomes, what should we do and where should we do it and why should we do it? And I think this is a question that comes up not just in solar irrigation, but in every single intervention design. So I thought it's worthwhile us basically asking the question, what do we mean by sustainable groundwater? Because this is a question that, that I think is a prerequisite to being able to answer, will solar irrigation result in groundwater unsustainability? And the standard way of doing this is to say the Groundwater Estimation Committee says it should be on a sustainable basis, it should be control in indiscriminatory exploitation, but what does that really mean? So I think traditionally, the way Central Groundwater Board has defined this is what I would call the safe yield model, which basically says that as long as abstraction is less than recharge, that's safe yield, or less than some fraction of recharge, that's safe yield. And that's what we would call a bucket model. The problem in this general framing is that groundwater and surface water have historically been regulated separately, where therefore groundwater is treated as a bucket and surface water is treated as water that falls over the ground and runs into a stream. And those tend to be completely different agencies. And this leads to a problem because actually the problem is, how do we define groundwater sustainability when we all understand that in fact these are interconnected resources? Groundwater, groundwater feeds streams through base flow, and groundwater in turn is recharged by surface water bodies. Now, I don't have time today to go through the detailed math. This is in a paper that we published in EPW. There are many, many papers published by USGS along these lines. But basically that they argue that if you looked at just the surface water balance, you would have rainfall, which is precipitation, and it can only end up as going into the ground as recharge, running off as stream flow or evapotranspiring. And if you looked at groundwater balance historically, that means in pre-human terms, groundwater was not a bottomless sink. So any water that came in as recharge had to leave groundwater as base flow, and that there had to be a remain in equilibrium so that the system could remain in equilibrium. And so at the end of it, basically all rain recharge that fell on Earth historically had to end up as some outflow from a river basin. That being the case, when humans came and began to start modifying the watershed and started pumping, you now had a new set of equations. And the groundwater, the equation in order to maintain what we call no net depletion, that is what we would call a change in groundwater volume, would basically result in an equation which looked like this, which would say that anything that came in as rainfall at the end of the day had to then end up as submitting discharge runoff or ET. But the main problem, the main point of this is that any pumping that we do today had to come at the extreme of some historical discharge that was leaving, some historical way in which the water was leaving the watershed should now be substituted by additional ET that irrigation is contributing to. And so there's basically no, there's no free lunch here, basically, is the point of this. Now, the problem is that most Indian aquifers are so overexploited that what we end up doing is saying that the condition for groundwater sustainability is that extraction has to be less than recharge. And the reason is because that many aquifers in India no longer have any connection to surface water, because shallow aquifers were depleted many, in some cases decades ago, at least in the area that I work in, shallow aquifers were depleted decades ago, which means that there's no real connection. And you're really talking about a water table that's going back and forth between two, between the pre-monsoon and post-monsoon region, in which case, if we accept that we don't care about surface water flow and so on, we can, in a very loose way, say that the groundwater budget is extraction has to be within recharge, so that you don't continue to have depletion. I just wanted to add as a caveat that if there was actually any wetlands or environmental flows or waste flows that we were concerned about, we would need to rethink this entire definition of what sustainable groundwater recharge is. So having said that, I think the next question is basically, how do we then, now having identified what the budget is, what the maximum allowable groundwater abstraction is, the question is, how do we tweak policy so that we start moving towards it? And I think it's worth saying that once we've set a limit on abstraction, the next thing is basically, how do we achieve it? So you might say that if we are overexploited, this is basically a demand curve for groundwater. With free electricity, we might be, somewhere here where basically we might be overexploiting water far over what the sustainable limit that I defined previously was. But the question is basically, how do we reach there? How do we get there? And in the developed, and this is in the case of if you had free electricity, of course, if it's diesel, the current groundwater exploitation might be at either higher or lower than the sustainable groundwater. We don't know exactly where it is. The point is that developed countries have addressed this problem, many developed countries have addressed this problem by setting hard limits on groundwater abstraction, by saying that this is a groundwater district, this is all the water that you can take, and then they auction the licenses to do it, or they have a permitting system in some way. And by doing that, what they do is they basically are able to ensure with good enforcement of those abstraction limits, that the amount of water that is pumped doesn't actually exceed the groundwater budget. Now, the problem with that approach, of course, is that you have a willingness to pay curve. You set a sharp limit on abstraction, but because you don't know exactly what this willingness to pay curve is, the price of groundwater that emerges from an auction might end up being quite variable. And this politically is okay in the developed world, where agriculture is only a small contributor to jobs and GDP, and environmental lobbies tend to be fairly strong. So environmental concerns take precedence, and they have very, very strong regulations, whether you think about the Endangered Species Act in the US or other similar legislation in other parts of the world. That, of course, we understand doesn't work in India. We don't have the same ability to say we're going to set hard limits and then we're just not going to care about who gets the water and how much it's going to cost them. And we aren't able to do that for obvious reasons, because a large number of farmers depend on groundwater for livelihoods. I think that the solar irrigation with the feed-in tariffs is a very, very nice solution, policy solution, and it's designed to address what I would call the Goldilocks problem. We understand how it works, that there's net metering. So basically at the margin, the feed-in tariff essentially is setting the equivalent of setting a price or an opportunity cost for groundwater, because the farmer has to decide whether to apply that, to pump and apply to the crop, or to sell back to the grid. Now, essentially then what the feed-in tariff is doing is setting a price for groundwater. And the question then is that and then there's some way, obviously you'll have to convert the rupees per kilowatt hours converts to rupees per meter cubed, and that might vary depending on groundwater depth. But I think the important piece here is that we don't exactly know what this willingness to pay curve for groundwater exactly looks like in every part of the country. Because if it was here, then you would have groundwater, solar irrigation basically resulting in less groundwater abstraction than is the sustainable limit. But if it was in fact here, where people were willing to pay a lot more for groundwater because it was just, they're growing highly valuable crops with it, then the same feed-in tariff would result in a groundwater exploitation level, which is above the sustainable limit. And I think ultimately then, at least the way I think of it is helpful to then characterize what is the nature of this aggregate willingness to pay curve in different blocks throughout the country. So what me and my colleagues, Anjali and Shilpa at A-Tree did was basically to say, can we develop a framework which will help us develop a typology to say where would ultimately, where would different feed-in tariffs make you end up on the groundwater exploitation curve, and how does that compare with what the groundwater budget for that place is? That's the maximum allowable groundwater exploitation. And so we started off with a set of questions. We left, we said, of course, there are some preconditions without which you wouldn't be able to implement SIP at all. And we said we're not going to look at canal command areas for the moment. And then if you look at free grid electricity, basically what we said is if we wanted to come up with that groundwater demand curve, how would we do it? So we would have to look at the crop water, the irrigation water requirement, which is basically take a number of different crops. For each crop, we would be able to figure out what the irrigation water requirement is based on the rainfall in the area and the potential evapotranspiration and the crop coefficients for that particular area. We would be able to figure out what the average yields for that particular region and soil type in the country is, and given average nutrient levels and so on. And then we would be able to figure out what the average price is. And this would, of course, vary very significantly depending on access to markets and so on. But making a bunch of assumptions, we would be able to construct a groundwater demand curve. And then we would be able to construct a groundwater budget, on the other hand, by using a fairly simplistic heuristic on what fraction of recharge are we going to say is allowable as an extraction. And then hopefully that would allow us to end up where a given region would end up under an SIP feed-in tariff system. And then in the end of it, and this is still work in progress, we haven't got there because we're still assembling the data sets. It didn't occur to us to do this until IWMI asked me to do this talk. But where I'm hoping we would be able to get with this is then to develop some kind of a typology where we would be able to classify districts based on the goal, on the where they are on the Goldilocks curve, if you want to think about it at the moment. And then if they are going to be, when different levels of feed-in tariffs are introduced, if they're going to push the system into overexploitation or ensure that the system stays within the water budget. So this is really what we are hoping. As I said before, this was being done by some small funding from India Climate Collaborative, and it's work in progress. We are going to repeat this exercise for other rural water security interventions. And please do contact us, my colleague Anjali Neelakantan, if you have either comments on this framework or you want to collaborate with us in some way. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Veena, for really sticking to the timing. And so, of course, while looking at the number of slides, I was thinking perhaps it may run over time, but you were quite precise enough to be in pretty much in time. And now it's open for audience question, but I don't see any in the chat box right now or the Q&A. So what I would do in that case, Veena, that, yeah, let me meanwhile, utilize this time to ask you about one question at least, because I really liked the way that you wanted to do it with the typology and looking into the typology and within a framework of demand curve and the budget is more from the supply side and deciding the feed-in tariff. So could you please elaborate more on that?
Elaborate on the typology, on the concept of typology.
Yeah, because now again, what happens, the demand is not static. As you yourself mentioned, depending upon the kind of the cash crops or the commercial crops or the other crops. So how,
I don't have, demand isn't static because prices vary, everything varies. This is true. Yesterday's newspaper said there was a crop, I think, where in Bihar, where they're getting now 1 lakh rupees per kilo, and I think the problem is, then if you, the way I understand it is solar irrigation then is, it's difficult to control abstraction if prices are sky high, right? If a farmer is able to grow gold in his field, it doesn't matter what you do, how how high you put the feed-in tariff, they're still going to be able to find that abstracting water is more valuable. So I think it works well in places where groundwater is not that valuable. The access to markets is not that great. But in Bangalore, for example, farmers are pumping water from 1,000 feet they're pumping water from 1,000 feet to grow tulips for the European export market. That's a very, very high value crop, a lot of precision agriculture. It's really hard to imagine that if you have very high prices, you can do anything about it. So I think that ultimately there's going to be a set of places where we say that it's possible, because the market prices are, it's not conducive enough that people can do crazy stuff. In other places, I think eventually we are going to have to start talking about maximum groundwater limits to groundwater. And as Shilp just pointed out in the chat box, I saw that he said, well, enforcement is a problem. I didn't want to get into enforcement. I thought maybe today's talk, it would be too complicated to get into enforcement because that's a whole other set of factors. So eventually what we are hoping though is, let's at least put the framework out there, see what we get with the typologies, understanding that there are going to be error bars out there, but at least we'll be able to say where you're at least in a safe zone.
Okay, so thank you, and I am happy that you have seen and responded to Shilp's question. And there's, I think, one more. I'll just try and put it to you on from Soumya from Mimi, and she has a question: will water prices in informal markets be a good enough proxy for WTP, willingness to pay?
I mean, I think that's a great this thing. I don't know how extensive water markets are everywhere in India. I know Gujarat, these informal markets exist. In parts of India where I've worked, informal markets don't exist. But on the other hand, those are places where their hard rock groundwater yields are low. So maybe solar irrigation is not conducive anyway for other reasons. So I think it's an interesting idea. If we are able to get prices, I definitely think that that's a good proxy.
I guess there are some other questions also, perhaps because maybe then you are seeing on the chat and maybe we can...
Oh, I'm seeing on the Q&A, yeah.
Yeah, all right. So I think we'll share these questions with you and subsequently even we can answer them subsequently. And so I think before I move on to the next speaker, we have a quick opinion poll question from the audience, including speakers as well as the panelists. They are also, and the question you can see is, will rapid expansion of SIPs, where SIPs replace electric and diesel pumps, lead to further groundwater depletion in your country or the region? Okay, so here you have the answers. So most of the people, of course, are giving more diplomatic response, yet it depends. So that's what it is, and followed by yes. So I think the response is pretty much perhaps on the expected line. So thank you, audience, for a really very well answered question. So I think then we move on to the next speaker. Second speaker in our today's series is Dr. Meha Jain. And Meha, as I said, she's from Michigan, University of Michigan. And she is going to be talking about impact of climate change on groundwater, and also further taking it forward that how further impact of groundwater abstraction is really going to have impact on agriculture. So Meha, over to you. Please share your screen, and you have another 12 minutes for making a presentation.
Great, thank you so much. All right, is my screen shared?
Oh yeah, it is.
Perfect. All right, well, thanks so much for the invitation to speak at this event. As Dr. Sikka said, my name is Meha Jain, and I'm currently an assistant professor in the School for Environment and Sustainability at the University of Michigan. So following up on Veena's really great and informative presentation, I wanted to present some work that my lab is doing, trying to understand the linkages among climate change, groundwater depletion, and agricultural production focused on India. So I don't need to spend much time setting up the problem because, as everyone here knows, India is a global hotspot for groundwater depletion. It's the largest consumer of groundwater. This map shows global unsustainable water consumption for irrigation in pink globally. And as you can see, India has several hotspots in both Northwest and South India. At the same time, India is expected to face some of the largest negative impacts from warming temperatures due to climate change. So this map shows estimated yield loss in 2050 compared to present yield values. And countries that are in red are going to have yield losses. And as you can see, South Asia, which is highlighted here in this box, is projected to have large yield declines. So what I'm going to talk about today are what are the impacts of these twin challenges of climate change and groundwater depletion on agricultural production, and what are the feedbacks among these three different variables. I also am going to look into whether there are any adaptation strategies that might be able to reduce some of the negative impacts of groundwater depletion on agricultural production. So I'll present two specific projects. The first is looking at the feedbacks among these different variables, and then the second is looking at the impact of groundwater depletion on agricultural production and whether there are any adaptation strategies that can reduce this negative effect. So while these projects do not directly examine the potential for solar irrigation pumps, they potentially can suggest where groundwater depletion may have the largest impacts on agricultural production, and this might help inform where solar irrigation pumps are potentially targeted and deployed. So let's go into this first project. So here's the conceptual figure that I showed earlier, but what I've done is I've included the data that we used in this paper within each of these three variable bins. So as our measure of groundwater depletion, we're using groundwater depth data from wells across India that we obtained from the Central Groundwater Board. For agricultural production, we're using a remote sensing or satellite measure of crop water stress. And then for impacts of climate change, we're using gridded weather data, so rainfall and temperature, as well as future climate change projections. And we link all of these using linear regressions. So just to give you a little bit of information about the remote sensing product. So we developed a measure of evapotranspiration at a scale of 1 by 1 kilometer across all of India using MODIS satellite data. I'm not going to go into the details of how we did this right now, but I would be more than happy to answer any questions about this after the talk. So the main research questions are, what are the impacts of warming temperatures on groundwater and groundwater depletion on crop water stress? So this is just a schematic of our regression results. And basically what we found was that both deeper groundwater depths and higher temperatures were associated with increased water stress. So what these results suggest is that warming temperatures and groundwater depletion will increase crop water stress. This is not surprising given that warming temperatures will lead to increased crop water demand, which could likely lead to increased crop water stress if you're not able to increase irrigation to fully meet this demand. Interestingly, though, what we found was that the effect of warming temperatures on crop water stress was actually pretty small. So what we found was for every 1 degree Celsius of warming, crop water stress only increased by about 2 to 6%. So what this suggests to us is that farmers are somehow adapting their farm management practices to meet this increased crop water demand from warming temperatures. So because we found this result, we did the second analysis where we wanted to look at the impact of temperature on groundwater depletion. And when we ran this regression, we found that higher temperatures were associated with deeper groundwater depths. So what this suggests to us, along with the previous results, is that as temperatures warm, farmers are increasing the amount of groundwater that they use to meet increased crop water demand and to minimize crop water stress. So in other words, farmers are responding to warming temperatures by irrigating their crops more, which is leading to increased groundwater withdrawal, which could potentially lead to more groundwater depletion than current baseline values. So what we did next was we projected what would happen in 2050 under future climate change projections using the results from our regression coefficients. So basically we said, if we had X amount of warming in 2050 based on these climate projections, how much do our regression estimates say that groundwater depletion would increase? So what this graph is showing is the left-hand bar is showing current estimates of net groundwater change based on the well depth data that we had access to. And then the following 4 bars are representing what groundwater depletion could look like in the future in 2050 based on future projections, where on the left-hand side, we have less warming, and on the right-hand side, we have more warming based on higher RCP concentration pathways. So what we can see is that in the worst case scenario, our results suggest that groundwater depletion rates could more than quadruple compared to current rates. And once again, this is under the largest climate change scenario. When we examine what our projections of groundwater loss are spatially, we find that depletion will not be evenly distributed across the country. So this map is showing our projected groundwater loss estimates in 2050 with redder colors representing greater amounts of depletion. And once again, each of these panels represents the least climate change trajectory on the left, and then the biggest climate change impacts on the right. So now I wanted to go into the second project that I'm going to discuss today that examines whether there are any adaptation strategies that can reduce negative impacts of groundwater depletion on agricultural production, and also try to estimate what the potential impacts of groundwater depletion could be. So for this project, I'm going back once again to the same conceptual figure to highlight what data sets that we used. So our estimate of groundwater loss and irrigation is we're using village level irrigation data that we sourced from a variety of different census data sets in India, and also projections of groundwater stress from the Central Groundwater Board. Our measure of agricultural production in this study is winter cropped area, which we measured using satellite data. And then our weather data that we used in this paper was gridded rainfall data. And once again, we linked these all using linear regression models. So the remote sensing measure that we developed is a measure of winter crop production across India, once again at a 1 by 1 kilometer resolution. And we focus on the winter season because it's the largest dry growing season in India that primarily relies on groundwater irrigation. So specifically, we examined what are the potential impacts of groundwater depletion on winter cropped area. So to answer this question, what we did was we took our maps of winter cropped area that we developed using satellite data and overlaid those on maps of future groundwater stress from the Central Groundwater Board, and also village level information on whether irrigation was coming from groundwater versus canal irrigation, and also the proportion of irrigation that was coming from these different sources. And once we aggregated all of these data, what we were able to find was the amount of winter cropped area that was being irrigated by potentially unsustainable groundwater sources. And when we did this, what we found was that about 20% of India's winter cropped area is being irrigated by these unsustainable groundwater sources. And this suggests, in sort of the worst case, unrealistic but upper bound scenario, if farmers were to completely lose access to all of this overexploited groundwater, this means that India could lose up to 20% of its winter crop production. And what we did here was we actually mapped out where these losses would occur And once again, colors more in red, or basically darker red, represents areas that will face greater loss. And you can see that most of the winter crop reduction would occur in central and northwest India. So what we wanted to look at next was, so say that we do have this case where villages are losing access to groundwater irrigation. We wanted to look at what's the capacity of canal irrigation to mitigate that loss. So how effectively can canal irrigation serve as a substitute irrigation source? So to do this, what we did was we linked at the village scale, what type of irrigation was being used. Was it canal, groundwater, or a mix of the two, with our winter crop production data? And by doing this, we could basically get estimates of how much winter crop production is associated with canal irrigated villages versus groundwater irrigated villages within the same blocks, districts, and states. And when we did this, we found that canal irrigation compared to groundwater irrigation is largely associated with less winter cropped area and also increased sensitivity to rainfall variability. So what this suggests to us is that canal irrigation may not be a reliable substitute for groundwater irrigation, particularly in low rainfall years. What we did next was we took the results from our regression and then we applied them to our estimates of crop area loss that I showed initially a few slides back. And what we found was that if all of this lost groundwater is replaced with canal irrigation, India could still lose up to 7% of its winter cropped area. So this suggests that groundwater and canal irrigation are not substitutable across much of the country. So this map once again shows projected losses with more red colors representing larger losses. And you can see once again that much of the loss is concentrated in central and northwest India. So how can these findings be used to inform work on solar irrigation pumps? Well, with the first project, what this suggests is that warming temperatures could exacerbate India's groundwater crisis by increasing irrigation demand to meet increased crop water demand. And it could be important to take this increased withdrawal into account when planning where solar irrigation pumps may be the most beneficial. And in the second project, we found that if groundwater is lost from overexploited regions, the largest impacts will be in central and northwest India. So this could also be important to take into account when planning solar irrigation. So thanks, I'd like to thank the organizers of this webinar for the invitation to speak here today. I'd also like to thank the co-authors on these two papers, particularly Nishan Badarai, who is a postdoc in my lab who led the first project. Thanks so much.
Hello, thank you very much, Meha, for an excellent presentation. And I see one or two questions. So, oops, let me stop the timer. You are well within the time. So, we have a question from one of our colleagues from IWMI Colombo asking that groundwater depletion in the Northwest is not mainly due to winter crops, but due to rice irrigation. How do you account this?
That's a really great question. So in our study, we didn't use any sort of model simulations. It was all empirical data. So we believe that the impacts of rice irrigation are being accounted for in our model because we're using real estimates of groundwater depletion after the monsoon season, after that withdrawal has occurred.
Okay, so I am seeing the question in the thing. There is one question by Aditi in the chat box also. So let me take that, and then Soumya, I'll come back to yours, depending on the time. There is a question from, I guess, from Aditi that winter crop is from months of October, November onwards, and she has noticed that West Bengal shows very little winter cropped area, though it grows a lot of boro paddy, which is, of course, almost during that period, starting December, January, May. So what do you think? Because in your map, and that's what she's having a question, that there is some kind of, whatever is the ground situation and what is coming out of your map, perhaps if you can elaborate on that.
Yeah, that's a great question. So the way that we defined winter crop was we looked at the remote sensing data from November until mid-April. So basically what we looked at was whether there was a greenness, increase in greenness, and then a green down, which is representative of crop growth. So it's possible that if areas are planting crops a little bit later and that peak greenness does occur later, it is possible that we are missing that. And that's a caveat that we do put in the remote sensing paper, but I should have mentioned that here. Thanks so much.
Now, then there is a question. Maybe I think, Samya, if you excuse me, because I'll go to the other question because you had a chance of this. Have you accounted for the depths of Central Groundwater Board monitoring wells? Because this says that 80 to 90% are dug wells and frequently record a purged water table. Irrigation wells are generally much deeper and experience dry season water levels. And there are, so that's what they say, that how in that cases it is going to be. I know it's very, very long, big question. So maybe you can always try and look into that and you can answer it subsequently. I would not like to have more time on this very longish question at this moment. Then there is I think this is going to be perhaps the last one which we can take. It's again from Soumya, and she's curious to know if the classical measurement error that is associated with remotely sensed data, which might be impacting your findings. Also, what is the unit of observation in your regressions as well data, crop stress, and temperatures are measured at different spatial and temporal resolutions? So I think it's a pretty good question. Perhaps I think, Meha, if you can throw some light on that.
Yeah, those are two really great questions. So we don't believe that there's significant non-classical measurement error in our remote sensing estimates. And this is based on extensive validation that we did both for the ET product and also winter cropped area across different regions in India. And I would be once again more than happy to talk about that a little bit more offline if you'd like. And the unit of observation for the evapotranspiration, that first project, we did that at the well level. So it was a grid cell of about 3 by 3 kilometers. And what we did was we just adjusted the resolution or resampled our data so that everything was at that same spatial resolution. And the second project was done at the village scale using village shape boundaries.
And I see really, I think maybe that's a very longish question by Peter, and it's very interesting. So maybe the time is short, Peter, and I think I'll pass it on to the speaker and to get back with you on your particular question which you have raised. It's a very important question. There are 2 connected comments and the questions in that. So Meha, if you can have a look at this question on the Q&A box, and maybe subsequently if you can respond to it, because I have to respect the time. And also I duly to respect the audience and their questions, but I'm really bound by maintaining the timing. So I'm sorry, Peter, but we'll get back to you. Definitely, we are very legitimate and very right question. So thank you, Meha, and for a nice presentation. And now I think we move on to the third presenter of the day, and which is Dr. Mainuddin. As I said, Mainuddin is from CSIRO, and he'll be talking about the volumes of groundwater extraction from electric and the diesel pumps in Bangladesh, and whether also, we talk about the field scale water management and how that really can save water at what scale, at small scale or at basin scale, and how he's also going to be extrapolating and talking about the SIPs in terms of groundwater extraction in Bangladesh. So over to you, Dr. Mainuddin.
Thank you, Dr. Sikka, and good evening from Canberra to everyone. This is some of the works that we have been doing mostly in Bangladesh and Eastern Gangetic Plain for various projects funded by SCR. So I acknowledge my colleagues from various institutions. If you look at the Bangladesh, everybody knows that Bangladesh was once a rice importer with 75 million people. But now we reached the self-sufficiency even with 170 million people. The production has increased over the last 3 decades by about threefold, and that was possible not the expansion of area, rather cropping intensification, particularly growing of Boro rice, and then which average yield of rice has uh, increased over twofold over the 3 decades. So agriculture sector, as you can find, that has gone through a remarkable transformation and revolution in Bangladesh. And that transformation in agriculture happened mainly because of groundwater. If you see the right-hand side of the figure, and this is mostly groundwater by shallow tubes. So this is the line of the, as you can see, number of shallow tubes that's growing over since early 80s to now. And northwest region is the most intensive groundwater region, where almost 100% of the area is exclusively irrigated by groundwater, and this is by shallow tubewell, mostly by shallow tubewell. There are also deep tubewell, and then shallow tubewell. There are both diesel operated and electricity operated. Uh, Obviously, with this, we have seen that there are a lot of concern about groundwater, because as groundwater levels are falling, as you can see in these maps, the red dots where groundwater level is a bar in the area, where groundwater level is depleting to the unsustainable level. Though there is no increase in area now, but even in shallow aquifer, we can see that in the peak time, groundwater level is dropping below the suction limit. So in some areas that farmers are shifting to submersible pump or deep tubewell. There are many causes of groundwater. We have done comprehensive studies, and there are a lot of myths about the groundwater, as you see. So there are strong perception in the policy circle, and that Boro rice is responsible for groundwater decline, which may be true partly in some regions, but there are a lot of other reasons that we found. I'm not going into that discussion now. There is general perception that 3,000 to 5,000 liters of water is required, which no one knows. So we could not find any evidence in that Bangladesh. And then government is vigorously promoting AWD and other water saving measures. But whether they are having any impact, that is a separate question. We investigated very comprehensively in 2 seasons in Bangladesh, about 420 rice plots irrigated by different types of irrigation equipment like deep tubewell, shallow tubewell, solar pump, deep tube, shallow tubewell, electric, diesel, to understand that how irrigation is happening, how much water farmers are using, what are the cost, what are the benefit of every plot. So it's a very comprehensive study we have done. Looked at the variety. So I'm not going into detail of this cost of production, total income, net benefit by location, variety, and type of tubewell we can find. Find anyone is interested, we have a comprehensive report and paper we can share with you. I would like to go into the cost of irrigation. The cost of irrigation is highly variable. It depends on the on different price mixing mechanism, and it's as high as around 35% of the total production cost of rice. And this is mainly because of different crop pricing models available in the market. There are area-based, there are area plus diesel fixtures plus diesel, there are card system, there are by irrigation system. So many areas, even with shallow tubewell, electric, diesel has different rates. In some areas, like in Ishurdi, there is a crop share that 1/4 of the crop will be harvested by the pump owner as fee for irrigation. So if we convert those, then we find that there is a wide variation of the unit cost of rice. As you can see here, this is electric, this is diesel, and solar power. What we found is very surprising is that even the solar irrigation we monitored for 1 year is as costly as shallow tubewell irrigation by diesel or electric pump. So we looked at also the comprehensively the irrigation water use versus the demand, and as we can see the comparison here at different location, you can find that particularly the shallow tubewell farmers are very prudent in using irrigation water. There are hardly any over pumping in the field, and they are very efficient in applying water to the field. Deep tube well, which is a bit BMDA deep tube well, which is a bit cheaper, we can see some oversupply. And so solar irrigation is also very efficient because they are managed by professionals, so they are applying irrigation to the field much efficiently than deep tube well. So if you look at the here I'm showing some of the water use and comparing the water use versus demand. As you can see that electric, diesel, and solar power, as you can see, there's very little differences between the whatever is required and what water is supplied, except in deep tube well, there is some oversupply in deep tube well. But this is not really lost from the system. So if you look at the actual water used by the crop, that is what is we say that 3,000 or 5,000 liter of water is required, which is wildly overestimate. In fact, the real water use is the ET, which is around 600 to 660 or 700 liter per kilogram of rice, as you can see in the figure that we estimated for two regions, which is pretty close in both seasons for 420 plots. If we look at the solar, now I'm showing solar irrigation. In Bangladesh, in the Northwest region, there are a lot of solar pumps, which is ITCOL model. There was a discussion on third day of the webinar. There are big systems. They are run by NGOs, as you can see in the figures. They receive government subsidy, and the area serviced, this area was serviced earlier by small shallow tube well. So this shallow tube wells has been gone. Now its whole area is supplied by these solar pumps. So they currently they can run only during the irrigation season, but they are trying to diversify the income and sell electricity to the grid, which is still not happening as so. If we look at the benefit of solar irrigation, obviously there are environmental benefit, and that is what this was promoted to reduce emission from the rice field, though Bangladesh has only 0.3 or 0.35% of the total emission in the world. So, but what we have found that the water supply is more efficient. Obviously, is they are run by the professionals, and then provide. There are some these solar pumps provide also some other services like rice milling, spice milling, and other things to the community. So there are a lot of concerns as well related to solar irrigation. The cost of irrigation, as of now, what we have found is that is as high as shallow tube well irrigation. So that is farmers are paying the almost same. And there are risks that they may not get water at the right time because there's a big system. If the system is not functioning because of cloud and other things, though they have a backup mechanism, there is risk. There is so it may not serve oil. There is also then question of whether influential farmer gets priority as they are serving a large area. There are large typology of farmers. There is question that whether marginal farmer will get the priority or not. And then there is no choice for the farmer within that command area. They have to buy water. Either they buy it or not. So if the water price goes up, then in the future, farmers has no choice. So while there is environmental benefit, how does solar benefit really benefit the farmer? That is a big question we need to understand. If we look at the irrigation, evolution of irrigation in Bangladesh, as I have shown this figure in the right-hand side, it has until early 80s, the irrigation was done only by LLP and deep tube well, and they were run by the government controlled agency, and there was a lot of mismanagement, corruption, and others. Then government liberalized the market and allowed the shallow tube well to freely import and install. That is the reasons for revolution that taken place in Bangladesh in terms of groundwater irrigation. Now with this solar model of that big, large solar pump run by NGOs or companies, we are, I think, going back to the backwards. So it is again that we are giving the control for the system from individual farmers to the big companies. So it could be that in are we depriving the farmers of free choice? That is a big question. So if we look, there was a Minor Irrigation Act in 2017 that government farmers need to take a permission to get install a shallow tube well. And we can already find the newspaper, Oditi can read this, that already there are some harassment to the farmers that they cannot get the permission to install, and then there are other mismanagement by the government agencies or harassment. Uh, however, if service provider can reduce the, so there are concerns that legitimate concerns of those minor irrigation rules or big solar pump. However, if service provider can reduce those concerns and provide reduce really the price of water and provide good service, that has the potential to benefit the farmers. So individual solar pump are not much as we have seen in the Northwest region. There are high initial cost, no subsidy in Bangladesh, but the initial, because of high initial cost, farmers cannot invest. They occupy a lot of land, and if it is for rice, it is they need a lot of solar panels, and then there are other risks, foggy and cloudy days, technical difficulties, and there are Bangladesh that is weak, there is no sun. So we looked at some of the performance of the individual solar pump, particularly in Bihar, in West Bengal, in Nepal, Terai, and we found that we looked at their performance. As we can see that they need at least drive frequency is necessary 13 hertz, which is available only when sun emits radiation, certain radiation of 300 to 330 wave per meter square. So they are in average because the dry season is the winter season. The solar radiation is available for limited hour, which is only 5.5 hour sun is every year. So with the ET demand, what we have found that these individual solar pump may be suitable for vegetable, but it could be a problematic for rice irrigation, and also it is a very important the selection of the sites, whether they are getting the sun. So in Bangladesh, if you've seen that in the open field, if they cover the field with the solar panel, then there is a risk that they will not be able to grow any rice underneath the solar panel. So what is the sustainability, and solar irrigation will affect their sustainability? It depends on which area we are talking about. In Bangladesh, as if we look at there is no increase in area possible in area, because all the cultivable area is under irrigation. So whatever is solar or other, there is no chance of further increasing the area. So if there is no increase in area, the water use is the same, whether it's by solar or other. But if there in some areas, whether there is expansion possible for further expansion and groundwater is already depleting, then it could be a problem that if farmer pump more, then sustainability could be a question that the recharge may not be enough to supply the pumping every year. So we did some studies. I'm not going into much detail. That we did some water balance studies in the whole Eastern Gangetic Plain. There are 9 districts, and we have done simple water balance. As you can see, these are in the Northwest region: Coach Bihar, Kurigram, Rajshahi, and South Chobbish Pargona. These are in the more west. As you can see, they are as the negative balance. That is the rainfall is low in this region. Groundwater is already used is very high. So if there is further expansion possible by area, then solar irrigation could be problematic in those areas if they pump the farmer start pumping because of free water. But if it is in Coach Bihar, where rainfall is very high, or in northern Bangladesh, in Kurigram area, Rangpur area, it doesn't matter because the rainfall is so high, and then still there are a lot of rejection of recharge. So the water saving technologies or solar irrigation will not make any difference to the groundwater depletion.
Dr. Mainuddin,
yeah, that's I'm in the last slide. So there is as I said, there are a lot of misconception about related to irrigation water use. There are some reasons concerned for or the current solar irrigation model in Bangladesh. We have some discussion in third day that they said that now cropping is changing. So the based on which 10 years ago the model they considered is no longer valid because the cropping pattern is changing. So they are now find it difficult to make them economically viable. So impact of solar irrigation, groundwater depends on local hydrological condition. In Bangladesh, it is unlikely to have any impacts. And this is a new system, obviously need research to understand the long-term benefit and gain. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mainuddin, for your excellent presentation. And I really don't see any question coming for you in the Q&A or even in the chat box. Aditi, I don't see. So maybe I think what Dr. Mainuddin, I know there was an excellent presentation, and of course, I do agree with you on that point that the impact of solar on groundwater sustainability, of course, is now the same at each and every situation. It's depend on the hydrogeology and the crops and the land use. And as you very rightly mentioned, that if that area is all already irrigated and there is no horizontal scope for any expansion, so then of course what you are telling is the truth. But suppose if that is not the case, then in that case, say for example, I do not know, in Bangladesh, in some part of southwest Bangladesh, in Khulna area, which is little bit high, with little bit uplands. So there, perhaps, do you think could be there some apprehension about this thing? That
the other thing is that that we haven't, even they pump more, doesn't mean that water is lost unless it is going into ground to a saline sink. So pumping more doesn't mean that water is lost from the system. So it will not have any resultant impact, as it is then recharging the groundwater anyway. So there are comprehensive studies that there are a lot of recharge happening from the rice field during the dry season to the aquifer. So there is not real loss. But if the farmers are using, let's say, the surface water sources by using solar pump, then it could be a loss. In some areas in Khulna or in southern Bangladesh, where groundwater is saline, farmers are using canal water. In their area, that could be a problem, because they might just run out of water from the canal by pumping more into the field, and then the extra water is going into a saline sink.
So no, I think I can take your point for certain. Of course, it will also depend upon the kind of the method of irrigation you're using and the kind of the crops we are using. So of course, perhaps it may be not so good to make a general statement. Yes,
general statement. Yes.
All right. Okay. So thank you very much, Dr. Mainuddin, for an excellent presentation. And now with that, we come to the next presentation by Dr. Wolfgang. And so Dr. Wolfgang, I think you can unshare your screen, Mainuddin.
I did already.
Yes, Dr. Wolfgang can share the screen. And as I said earlier, that he'll be walking us through about how the electricity can be used as a proxy for measuring the extracted volume of groundwater. So over to you, Dr. Wolfgang.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody, or good morning, wherever you are. So I'd like to share with you some experience from China and discuss the transferability to your solar wells problem. Overpumping is a worldwide phenomenon, and quota and water price are some instruments to limit groundwater use. But both quota and price require metering as a basis. Also, if just we want to know how much groundwater is pumped, if we want to assess the resources for water balances, we also need metering. So in principle, metering and fees are not necessary if land use management guarantees an equilibrium between the available water resources and the irrigation requirements. But if that is not so, then we better assess how much is pumped by metering. Now, what ways do we have to meter? The traditional is this mechanical water meter. It is not very useful in practice because of tampering with it, vandalism, etc. It's easily destroyed, and farmers just take it off if they don't want to pay. Now we have an alternative, high-tech alternative, where we put a policeman on every well, and that is the smart water meter, where you operate the well by a swipe card. and the swipe card carries your water right, and then there is a real-time data transmission. And this real-time data transmission is necessary so that people know the meter is still working. If it doesn't work, they have to send somebody to maintenance for maintenance immediately, otherwise farmers will just kick the whole thing off. Now, the problem is, of course, investment cost and especially maintenance cost. There is still opposition by farmers and vandalism, although it can be managed. There are many brands available and they have different principles of measurement. Here you see there is an antenna for the transmission, there is a power supply, and this is kind of the meter. Now, we took to other methods, and that is monitoring via a proxy. And one proxy is electricity consumption. But if we use the electricity consumption, we need a conversion factor, which may vary from well to well. It's in China, it's an advantage because now there are some new smart electricity meters on every well, which allow in real time to read the electricity use from the utility offices without going into the field. But of course, this is only feasible, this proxy electricity, if all wells are powered by electricity. This doesn't work for diesel. Now, monitoring via use time is the oldest method, especially in surface water allocation. It's very inaccurate. And there is the monitoring via land use and irrigation norms. And this is facilitated through recent advances in remote sensing. Usually it's only feasible in arid to semi-arid regions where you have little cloud cover in irrigation season. But with radar remote sensing, which we used also in China to penetrate the haze in winter, it was possible also to have clear pictures in these situations. But of course, you only see the application of the growth of the plant and so to speak, the use of water by the plant. You don't see whether it's surface water or groundwater. Now, here is a case where I think we were very successful, and that is an irrigation district in Gansu province of China, where all 700 wells of or 667 wells of the irrigation district were equipped with these smart meters. And the system has been working since 2015, and we have measured everything through all the seasons up to now, and it's still working well up to now, because it was maintained, and the maintenance was done via the fees collected. So the smart metering increased the water price, which formerly was only the electricity fee. Now it's doubled, and the doubling of the water price led to a reduction of 30% of pumping at most of the wells, not everywhere, but most of the wells. And this means it has a price elasticity. There's a price elasticity of minus 0.3. A doubling of the water price leads to 30% reduction. So this is a successful project, but it's just for this district and maybe for some other similar districts. If we go to North China Plain, which was the main, is the hotspot for overpumping in China, this cannot be applied in general. In the county which we looked at, there are about 8,000 wells, and the majority of them are small and primitive, as you see in these pictures here. And the only way to get from this very primitive stuff to information age is via electricity, because no matter how primitive the well, they are all electrically motored, and they have all electricity meters so that people can pay for the electricity they use. And that is the basis for our work. Of course, you have different lift, like shallow aquifer, deep aquifer, and surface water, and this has to be taken into account. But you can get the pumping rate or the volume pumped via the electric energy used if you determine this conversion coefficient by pumping tests. So you do a pumping test where you either use a flow meter, ultrasonic flow meter, or volumetric method. You need a stopwatch. You need depth to groundwater table. And if you do that for enough wells, then you get some average conversion factor, and you get a conversion factor for every well. For example, here in China, it was on average 2.6 cubic meters per kilowatt hours in the shallow aquifer, and 1.3, that is about a half cubic meters per kilowatt hour in the deep aquifer. Now, pumping tests have to be done for each type of water source. to account for the difference in pump lift. But the seasonal change of this conversion factor is not so large because the depth to groundwater is already deep, so the change in depth is small compared to the total lift, and the seasonal change of conversion factor was within 20%, so that's acceptable accuracy. Additional tests are only necessary if you have extremely dry years or if you have heavy depletion, then maybe you have to redo it every 4 to 5 years. The accuracy required for fee collection is 20% is acceptable, but it requires pumping tests at each well. Now, if you just do the determination of pumping for planning and water balances, you can do with much less pumping tests. If you are in a village and you have 20 wells, it's enough to get from an average conversion factor the water use of a well. Or even in a county, 20 to 30 wells are enough to get a good estimate of the pumping in the whole county. So this is for the first time that we really know how much people pump in each village in this county of China. Now let me turn to the solar pumping. Solar pumping, I had the privilege to see together with Tushaar Shah in Gujarat, and there are some pictures from our excursion. Now, irrespective of the source of electricity, and solar is also electric, volume is somehow proportional to energy. Now you can say volume is proportional to energy, or you can divide it by time and you say a pumping rate is proportional to power. So what you have to know is the power and that conversion factor. In a conventional case, the power N can be assumed constant, but in the solar case, of course, the power varies with solar radiation. So it varies over the day, it varies over the seasons, but the varying power can be recorded. Empirical equations can be determined to convert, like there is some work here in Saudi Arabia, where people determine the conversion via measured solar radiation. Of course, that is quite expensive. You cannot put a measurement for solar radiation on every well. There's a simpler approach. You record the power output as a function of time and get an average conversion factor between power output and pumping rate for different lift classes, maybe 3 or 4 lift classes. And then you can get the volume as an integral if you have this power record. Now, how do you get the power record? Now, in the solar village we visited with Tushaar Shah, they sell power to the grid. So everything is really monitored very well. You have fantastic data on the power output, both for kilowatt hours delivered to the grid and kilowatt hours used for pumping. Now, metering is done automatically in this case. A way to get solar wells to record the power and give a basis for conversion to water is to subsidize the connection to the grid to guarantee metering. Now, another way is to subsidize the kilowatt hours used by the pump. So if the kilowatt hours used by the pump are recorded, you subsidize electric energy anyway. Now, if they don't use electric power from the grid, you don't pay this subsidy to the utility. So you pay a smaller subsidy for measuring the kilowatt hours in the village, and you get a record. Now, the portable solar panel owners, they could also record the kilowatt hours delivered for the collection of their fees. And you can incentivize them to record it by paying for the data. And a last way of control, which I envisage, is that the maximum size of panels limits pump size. We had in the last talk some very interesting experience really from the field, and that is what we should not forget. So in this pump size and radiation situation, it limits the abstraction rate and the lift. And that is how you can control maximum amount, by regulating maximum size and number of panels. So I come to my conclusions. Groundwater pumping monitoring using electricity as a proxy is a feasible way of doing things. You get objective data records, you can compare. The conversion from electricity to water can be done with methods which are of acceptable accuracy and cheap. The sustainable monitoring of the method, the sustainable monitoring method is there, if electricity is metered, which is, for example, the case in China. And if you have these records, reconstruction of pumping in history is feasible, because usually if we just see what is happening in 1 year, we cannot draw any conclusions. You need about 10 years of data to see this changing in the time with the rain, with the season, to really understand what is happening. Now, monitoring of pumping is even feasible in real time. So you know for the season already what you used, and maybe you can hand out some warnings that you're close to the limits. Now, the challenges in China are that there is still some problem between the electric utilities and the water authorities regarding the sharing of data and information. And there is a challenge in fee collection. We know we have determined all these uses of water for the single wells, single farmers, very good, but the collection of fees is impossible. Farmers don't play along. And you know that from India, farmers are sometimes stronger than authoritarian regime. Then challenges in the case of solar power are, of course, that monitoring and control is only possible if power output is recorded. And pumping tests are also necessary, and they are somewhat more complex than in the case of the constant power N, because of this possible variation of the conversion coefficient, but it is feasible, as has been shown by some experiments. Now, with this, oops, I'm stuck, kind of. Yes, I have.
Okay. Thank you.
My last slide. My last slide is there. Okay, here. This is my last slide. I thank you. And
thank you.
There is a reference which you can look at to see some more details on how to do these pumping tests. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Wolfgang. And I am trying to see if there are right. So far, there are no questions from you in the Q&A, and I also don't see anyone in the chat box. So what I think it was interesting presentation, and Dr. Wolfgang, you very rightly mentioned, of course, the pump test is necessary. And you also mentioned that, yes, when there are deeper aquifer, water table is already deep, and a small change in water table depth, perhaps in overall total head, may not make much of a difference. Yes. Now, when we are developing these convergent factors and relationships, you know, even if the head fluctuations are not much, but the pump size to another pump sizes, and there are variety of pump sizes, and the efficiency varies a lot.
Yes.
So how do you take account of that?
Yes, I mean, for fee collection in China, you need a pump test for every well. And if they change the pump, of course, you have to repeat the pumping test. But if you if you determine efficiencies of pumping equipment, then this is also a way of going, that instead of taking the conversion factor, you get the efficiency. And with the efficiency, you can use the pump manufacturer's data to get a conversion factor. So that's another way of doing it, by using the efficiency. And efficiencies are then more easily averaged than the CF, the conversion factor. But that would only give you a good conversion for a village or for a number of wells together, not for a single well.
So there is a question for you, Dr. Wolfgang, from Aditi, that for a place that is hydrogeologically diverse, I would assume that you will need to work out the energy water volume extracted relationship for each of the major hydrogeology. I think you agree with that.
This is true. I mean, in our county, it's all the same hydrogeology. But if you have, for example, a very low transmissivity, that means the drawdown in the well is very large. And that may influence, of course, the lift considerably. So what we also did is we measured the water level in the wells. Now in India, for example, I've seen these open wells where it's very easy to get the water level. But if it is a closed well, it's not so easy unless they have left a little pipe for you to measure the water level, to get also this relationship. It's all a matter of relationships. And if you do a number of pumping tests, you get a chart from which you can read off things.
Yeah. All right. So thank you very much, Dr. Wolfgang. And now I request Dr. Tushaar Shah, and Dr. Tushaar Shah is going to make his presentation. And I said, so Tushaar, could you please share your screen to make the presentation? And Tushaar will be talking about the IWMI's experiment, which is very much well talked about on Dhundi, and also linking with the sky feeders about our and his experience or IWMI's experience or IWMI Tata program experience on that. So over to you, Tushaar. Tushaar, are you there?
Thank you. Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. And can you see my presentation?
Yes, we can see. Please go ahead.
Thank you. So I'm basically going to use my time to make this presentation, and I won't have time to make comments on the other presentations of the panelist. Is that understood?
Okay, we'll see as we go forward. If there is no time, we will definitely then excuse you from that.
Okay. So I would just like to kind of tell you a brief story. In 2014 annual research meet at IWMI Colombo, I and my colleagues, we made a presentation on the upcoming threat from the onslaught of solar pumps in India. Those were the early days for the rise of solar pump technology in irrigation. And we were concerned that farmers with solar pumps will run amok, and basically it will provide a very strong incentive for groundwater depletion. And therefore we proposed in our research meeting that IWMI should try and experiment to and showcase, paying farmers for the solar energy that they've generated, for not using that for pumping. And in that meeting, we had the head of the climate change program, and he immediately offered us $150,000 to showcase what we were saying in a village in India. So we went to, I and my colleagues, we went to a village called Dhundi, near where we work, which Wolfgang has visited, and Alok has, of course, been there several times. And we got 11 farmers who were using diesel pump. This village was a diesel pump village. There was no electricity for agriculture, and therefore all farmers were using diesel pump for irrigation. So obviously diesel pump irrigation was very expensive. When we offered them solar pumps, they kind of embraced them with both their hands. And we created a microgrid of these 11 solar pumps, and we persuaded the local electricity company to connect them to an 11 kV line and meter their power sales at a single point. The electricity company went further, and they offered them a 25-year contract to buy their surplus energy at 4.63 rupees. In the IWMI seminar, we had actually proposed that if we could do something like this, then it could produce a number of desirable effects. First, it would provide farmers an extra source of risk-free counter-climatic cash income for growing solar energy as a remunerative cash crop. It would incentivize conservation of groundwater and energy use in irrigation, because farmers will now trade off selling energy with pumping groundwater for irrigation. Farmers would get reliable, uninterrupted daytime power supply, which is saying a lot in India because farmers most of the time get nighttime power, which is very hard to use. Then it would reduce carbon footprint of groundwater irrigation. It would liberate electricity companies from the dead weight of farm power subsidies. Out of 90 distribution companies in India, only 4 are making cash profit today. And all those 4 are in Gujarat. Almost everywhere else, electricity companies are in a deep morass. And the main cause of that is subsidies to agricultural energy supply. So it would liberate discoms, because farmers would then generate their own energy and they won't depend for discoms for subsidized power. And last, reduce commercial and technical losses in providing power to farmers, because power will not have to transport to travel long distance. It will be produced on So these were the hypotheses that we suggested. Now, 6 years later, there is evidence to test some of these hypotheses. The first set of evidence is, of course, from this village where we started. In December 2015, we set up this cooperative. And in May 2016, they started evacuating surplus power to the grid. All these orange bars, they show the amount of power every month that these 11 farmers, and then some more added later, they evacuated to the grid. All the blue lines, blue part of the bar, it shows the amount of energy that they use for irrigation. Now, there are certain regularities in this. Number one, maximum use of power for irrigation is during April and May. Number two, the average amount of power that they evacuate every year is between 60 and 65%. Number three, the total amount of income that they earn, the net income that they earn from the sale of energy is very close to the total amount of income that net income that they earn from growing crops, not including dairy and poultry and other occupations. But growing and selling solar energy is nearly as good for the small farmers as a source of income as growing of crops. Now, Dhundi was a diesel pump village, so obviously its solar pumps were very, very, very attractive. But soon after Dhundi was commissioned, the National Dairy Development Board wanted to create a similar cooperative in another village called Mujkua. Now, Mujkua had only electric pumps, only grid-connected pumps. And these farmers came in to see Dhundi, and they got so taken up by the idea that they agreed to an unbelievable condition. The NDDB actually told them that they can get a solar pump only if they surrender their subsidized grid connection. Now, that's asking a great deal to the farmer, because a subsidized, a flat tariff connection in India is actually a lifelong privilege that farmers would not give up easily. But here there are 16 farmers who gave up their connection. They gave in writing that for 25 years they will not apply for a grid connection. And they got this solar pumps, which are then connected to the grid, and a very similar microgrid was formed. Here also, the pattern is pretty much the same. The orange bar, which shows the power export, is nearly as large or larger than the amount of power that is used in irrigation. This village also had hyperactive water markets. So all these farmers, these tubewell owners, are also making a good deal of money from selling irrigation service. There are wide and deep networks, buried pipeline networks, through which tubewell owners sell water to farmers far away from their own fields. So even here, we found that the ease or the right to supply or the opportunity to sell power directly to the grid kind of created an incentive for farmers to. So actually these two villages created the base for this large state-wide pilot called Surya Shakti Kisan Yojana, SKY, under which in 2018 and 2019, the government of Gujarat and the 4 electricity distribution companies solarized 82 feeders. About 5,400 tube wells were solarized on these 82 feeders. And one interesting thing about the SKY is that it has set up an extraordinarily rich monitoring system, online monitoring system, in which almost daily data is available on the amount of solar energy generated by each tube well, the amount that is consumed, and the amount that is evacuated by them, and several other elements of data. And I think IWMI is right now in the process of analyzing that data. Now, I think the financial model of this state level pilot has been discussed earlier. Basically, the solar pumps were given away free. Farmers contributed only 5%, and they had to pay a loan, or the government was to pay a loan on behalf of farmers, for which the government had taken a NABARD loan. The government offered them an FI feeding tariff of 3.5 rupees, plus another 3.5 rupees of generation-linked benefit, which was to be used to repay the loan on behalf of farmers. Every feeder that wanted to solarize had to have at least 70% of the tube wells agree to solarize. Then SKY farmers were promised 12 hours of daytime power every day. Non-SKY farmers, that is farmers on those feeders who did not turn solar, they would get only 8 hours. SKY farmers would get and could also be given an opportunity to augment the connected load before solarizing. In addition, they were given 25% extra panels than the connected load. So overall, it was a very, very rosy, very sugar-coated deal to get maximum acceptance from the farmers. And even after that, a large number of farmers actually refused to join. So this is the data that was analyzed very early in the game, about 6 or 7 months data. I'm sure Yashoda would have more recent versions of this data. But this itself showed that at that time, 2,190 farmers had solarized on those feeders, but 908, nearly 1/4 of them on each feeder, had refused to solarize. But among, if you look at all the 4 electricity companies, the distribution, for the distribution companies, this turned out to be a very profitable deal right at the start in terms of subsidy savings. These blue bars show the amount of money that the government spent, the distribution companies spent in terms of subsidy on farmers who did not solarize. And the orange bars, they show the subsidy that was saved by the distribution companies per horsepower. There is the Madhya Gujarat Electricity Company, for example, saved 1,068 rupees per HP during this period on the farmers who solarized. So for the distribution companies, this solarizing of tube wells is, of course, a great positive. Then this shows the benefits to farmers. The orange bars show that after getting free, after using solar energy for irrigating their own fields, the orange bar shows how much they earned by evacuating the unused surplus solar to the grid per horsepower. And that works out to between 700 rupees in South Gujarat to about 2,200, 2,000. Now, this is a 6 months data. So per month, it would work out to some 18 or 20,000 rupees per tube bill. On the other hand, the farmers who did not join, who did not solarize, for them, the irrigation, they still have to pay some minimal charges for grid electricity. So this is how much they paid, which is actually just a fraction of what it costs to serve power to them. Now, I think now there is a lot more data that is available, but the key point of data is whether the farmers' use of energy has changed after solarization. And this chart basically provides very early results on that. And I'm sure we'll have much better numbers in a few weeks. But this shows that the result is mixed. In Paschim Gujarat and in Dakshin Gujarat, the energy used after solarization was higher than before solarization. But in Madhya Gujarat and Uttar Gujarat, there was a significant decrease. That is, the grid power consumption was much higher than solar power, especially in Uttar Gujarat, where it was nearly 40–50% lower after solarization. In Madhya Gujarat also, it was a good 30%. But this is a very crucial piece of information because the groundwater, in terms of the impact of grid-connected solar on groundwater, I think a clear indication is whether energy consumption declined. Energy consumption in pumping groundwater declined significantly after solarization. Because when you switch from either flat tariff or zero marginal cost to a high marginal cost power, opportunity cost power, then you expect farmers to reduce consumption of power. But the evidence that we have, at least in this chart, is not unequivocal on this. But if you look at these numbers that Yashoda has just put up, which is basically, I think, the same, the energy evacuated. And she's also concluded that energy evacuated is more than energy used. You know, in Dhudi and Mujkua, we found that it was between 50 and 65%. And I think at the sky level, all the 4 level also, it's much the same. The energy evacuated is more than 50% of the total generated. Again, energy used is much higher during summer, as we found in Dhudi and Mujkua. And net energy evacuated is 49% of the total energy generated. So again, here, there are wide variations across companies. in Uttar Gujarat, that is North Gujarat, the energy evacuated is nearly 67% of energy generated. Now, this is where about 40% of the total electricity supplied by the Uttar Gujarat company is supplied to agriculture. So this big reduction in energy evacuated is very, very important. Whereas in Dakshin Gujarat, DGVCL, where it's just 16%, I mean, that company has just 5% of its total energy supply in agriculture. So for DGVCL, it is not really very important. So these differences are extremely important. So UGVCL is the highest, 67%, followed by PGVCL, again, where agriculture share in total energy supply is very high. In MGVCL is also, it's 24%, but here in DGVCL is just 5%. So there is a minimum decrease in the energy evacuation. Now, this original hypothesis that we had, I think between Dhundi, Mujkua, and the sky, I think there is a very clear evidence that selling solar energy, or growing solar energy in situ as a crop, using as much as you need for irrigation and selling rest to the DISCOM will be a non-trivial source of supplemental income for small farmers. For large farmers, it may not really matter very much. But given that most farmers in India are 1 hectare, 1.5 hectare farmers, the kind of net income that they can earn from selling energy can actually give crops a run for their money, especially because this is totally risk-free. It is counter-climatic. During drought, this income increases. During a very good monsoon year, this income decreases. So I think this income becomes very, very important for farmers. On third hypothesis, farmers get reliable, uninterrupted daytime power supply. I think that is absolutely, it's completely vindicated, especially for sky farmers, not so much for Mujkua farmers who are not connected to the grid, who cannot use grid power. They can just export power, they can't import power from the grid. But all the sky farmers who get 12 hours of daytime guaranteed power supply, for them, this is a major relief. And that actually is the major reason why farmers took to sky enthusiastically. Hypothesis 4, reduce the carbon footprint of groundwater irrigation. I think that's obvious. All the solar farmers are having a much lower carbon footprint, assuming that the carbon footprint from manufacture of solar panels is small in comparison to the amount of solar. Yeah. Evidence of reduce. So subsidy savings, again, I showed the data, I think very, very clear. But the most important reason why DISCOMs are very happy is that the AT&C losses, the technical and commercial losses on sky feeders, are down from 24% to just 7%. And in any case, the DISCOMs are allowing only 5%. So all the excess losses over 5% have to be distributed pro rata among solar farmers. So I think on all these hypotheses, the evidence is already very positive. The only thing on which we do not have clear evidence is whether the behavioral change has taken place, whether farmers are using significantly less energy in pumping groundwater now. And number 2, whether reduction in energy use necessarily means reduction in groundwater savings. So I find that some of this discussion, and this is my last concluding slide, that we have this 3 options.
Yeah, please. Please conclude shortly.
Yeah, and this is my last slide. So I find that on most criteria that matter, does it provide reliable irrigation for agriculture? Will it increase use of green energy? Will it incentivize water and energy conservation? Will it contribute to doubling of farmers' income? I think the Sky pilot provides evidence, strong evidence in support of all this. I think the only thing that may work against it is that it requires the DISCOMs to work directly with farmers. And that is a messy thing. It's not easy to scale out rapidly. You have to persuade farmers. You have to explain to farmers the benefits of that. Whereas the Maharashtra model has the advantage that you can use the developers-driven quick scale-out period. There is no need for government to invest in capital. And you can basically scale out very rapidly. Unfortunately, we don't have much evidence on what exactly is happening on ground in the Maharashtra model. That would provide us a better basis for comparing across these 3 options. Okay, with that, I think I conclude. Thank you, and sorry
Thank
for...
you. Thank you very much, Tushar. Thank you so much. And I don't see, let me see, there is one. Yeah, so Tushar, he has a question for you, Upali. Any idea of water sold, if any, for solar pumping and water consumed?
For Muchkuwa and Dhundi, yes, we have some data in both Muchkuwa as well as Dhundi. The water selling continues by solar pumps as well as by other pumps. The prices have hardened a little, but not really all that much. I had expected prices would harden much more, but they haven't really hardened all that much. On Sky, we don't have any data on water selling. We'll probably need to do some special field studies to understand that.
I think Mari also has a question. Perhaps I think it is for you, and it is: do the farmers still use electric connections from other tube wells, or do they use diesel pumps as well? We can very well see a reduction in energy consumption without reduction in water consumption. So means apprehension is that perhaps they are not, maybe they are using the diesel pump simultaneously and trying to look into that. I have that he has this question to you.
Yes, no, I think the diesel pumps are so much more expensive compared to both electricity as well as that in Dhundi and Muchkuwa, there is no diesel pump in use. They're all shelved. They're still there, but nobody uses them. There is just no demand for diesel.
Okay, so thank you very much, Tushar. So I think we come to the end of formal presentations by the speakers, and now we'll have our learned panelist interventions. So each panelist, as we have said, will have 5 minutes to respond, and we will have now 2 panelists, Simi Kamal from Pakistan and Anwar Zahid from Bangladesh. As Tushaar said that he has already used his time, so he wanted that we leave the time for the others. So we have what we would like to know from each panelist, that you have now listened to all these speakers, and so we would like you to situate your points based on what the speakers have mentioned. Like particularly if I try and look into the broadly, there were points made that the SIPs, perhaps their effect in groundwater depletion is not going to be all the same in size, all the areas. It depends which kind of hydrogeology, what kind of a land use of the crop they're using, and the extent of the already irrigated area. There were also a couple of good interventions on the typology wise, water budgeting, looking into the demand and supply, and the tariff and the feed-in tariff. So, and there was also a very good point made in terms of the warming or the increased temperature and vis-a-vis relation with the groundwater depletion and how there is an impact on water stress. So I think keeping those things in view, I would request our learned panelists to, based on their own experience, to try and say that how you feel that this is there and to what extent it matters, and if how you incentivize the farmers, will that matter? So in the context of your country or your own experience, how do you think, and particularly will SIPs really accelerate the groundwater crisis? So that is the question number 1 from you. And then the second question is, what can we ensure to see that the SIPs really do not accelerate the use of or accelerate the current groundwater crisis? So I think we have these 2 broader questions for our learned panelists. And I think so I'll start with the Simi. Simi, over to you, please. You have 5 minutes.
Okay, well, that's a lot to do in 5 minutes. I had originally jotted some points down according to the 2 questions, but really looking at these really excellent and thought-provoking presentations, I'd like to do it a little differently. And I'd like to begin with the questions that you asked us. Around 65% of us answered, we couldn't do yes or no. So we said it depends. And there's been some chat going on around that as well. So why do we say it depends? Because who can extract groundwater? By which means? What financial instruments? Subsidies, tariffs, financial products, loans, interest rates, all of that. It is that convoluted, that very complex. It's not even an equation. I would like to say very complex situation out of which would invent the question, it depends. Okay. And if we look at Peter, and I was very interested, the very first interesting question that came after the first two presentations. And he talked about an open market scenario where farmers will look for the most profit situation. Yes, if we had the open market, that is what farmers would do. But we don't have open markets. Mostly we do not have them. So then the question is, that's the first thing, an open market. Then we say, okay, if we had a rational world, in a rational world, we could, if we wish, look at groundwater, surface water continuum, look at it together. Then water loss has a very different meaning. Or we see it as a closed system where we say that it's about extraction and recharge. Then we can talk about water losses and we can analyze in a different way. If we add rainfall and precipitation, as in the case of Bangladesh, there is less impact of solar irrigation on groundwater. But this is if we lived in a rational world. And then we say, okay, we can do licensing, we can do zoning, because when we answer the question, it depends. The answer to that perhaps is setting limits. It's all about setting limits. And how we set limits depends so much on this scenario. So if we were to set limits by zoning and licensing, then we could look at water surplus and water stressed areas. We could look at cropping zones, agroecological zones. Very importantly, at urban and rural areas and their interconnections. We could look at hydrology and hydrological zone, at water balance. I know we've been talking about all of those. And then superimposed in all of this is the historical footprint. Okay. So I was fascinated today to really help pick that out from the various presentations. So we started with diesel pumps, that is extracting groundwater. And then we used electricity from the grid. It could have been hydropower or thermal or a mix. Then we moved on to using renewable energy, wind and solar. Then we have off-grid options. And then we are saying, okay, when we look at extraction of groundwater for agriculture and irrigation, we have a whole new concept of growing and harvesting solar energy that Tushaar just presented in so eloquently. And this is so interesting because if you look at the Paris Agreement and they're talking about a 2-degree centigrade world, they have already sent all of us who live in the tropical zones to hell. Because under that scenario, the only thing that these energy and send it for agriculture or use in agriculture elsewhere in the world. So this is the historical footprint. So I see huge problems ahead. And then when we talk about power and influence, because in my country, Pakistan, 85% of the farmers are smallholders. But the 15% big farmers, they set the agenda and they decide what tariffs are going to be, okay, what kind of energy is easiest to use. And solar has become really popular, but the use of solar energy has already shown us that we have destroyed some of our aquifers in the most water-stressed areas. And right now, around Lahore, in the Lahore area, which is very close to the Indian border, the area called Kusur, where I believe that on the other side of the fence, the way the fence has been put between India and Pakistan, very interestingly, there are doors in that fence, and sometimes because the fence is one kilometer inside Indian territory, some Indian farmers still have land on the Pakistani side of the fence, and they actually come in to do farming in that area. I mean, not many people know this. It's something amazing that local people do and how they work together. And they're having different tariffs on both sides and different kinds of solar energy incentives on both sides of the border is making extraction on one side so much easier than the other. So there are all the transboundary issues that we need to look at. And the power and influence means that people can influence the way tariffs and the financial instruments are set around solar energy, so that when we look at the factors and we talk about setting limits, those can be changed so quickly and can have major impacts. And the last but not least is the urban and rural scenarios. Because if we look at Chennai, what happened in Chennai and around Chennai, and we look at our Lahore area, what is happening is that solar energy is being used to get water cheaply, but then it is being sold to urban areas. It is not necessarily being used to enhance irrigation and agriculture. So in this scenario where so many changes are happening very, very fast, it is so hard to predict, because by the time we have one set of discussions underway and we just get around to the licensing and the rules and regulations around the use of solar energy for irrigation and for extraction of water, other scenarios have changed very, very fast. So given this, the second question that you asked us to talk about, which is what can we do to ensure the SIPs do not exacerbate current groundwater crisis and incentivize farmers to have a smaller groundwater footprint. So even here, we have to talk about setting limits. That's how I see it. Um, in terms of policy, I think different countries in different parts of South Asia are at different stages. I know in Pakistan, we don't have groundwater policy. We have one chapter in our national water policy. And there is certainly a shift. I mean, the policy encouraging shift from diesel to solar. Not enough, but certainly that is happening, and it will happen because solar energy is so much cheaper, so much easier to install. Then net metering. Net metering is already happening in urban areas. It's happening in homes. And of course, what you buy the electricity, what you pay, and what you sell it for, there's a difference of a factor of 4, certainly in Pakistan urban areas. I'm not sure how it's happening elsewhere. So that is quite a disincentive. So how do you set it to make it enough of an incentive? The feed-in tariffs, the zoning, how this works in water-stressed areas, how does it work in areas where we have what we call barani areas, where there's no irrigation, but we rely entirely on precipitation. So that would all have to be part of policy. And then I think there needs to be a lot of academia getting behind this, the data and analysis, the models in different agroecological zones, the training and capacitating, all of that needs to be done. And then at the field level, I think very, very quickly, we have to regulate unlicensed expansion of groundwater infrastructure. And especially though, because it is so easy, the solar infrastructure. Incentives to switch. And one of the ways that we could address it, and it's being tried in some part, I'm part of one of the experiments, is that where you do have permission to put up solar infrastructure for getting groundwater, that you don't provide batteries with it. So it only works during sunlight hours. Okay? And you don't store it. So you can only use it directly. Because the minute you can store, then the pumps would be running 24 hours. And as has happened in many parts of Pakistan, certainly, and I've heard about that in other countries as well. And then at the same time, having a number of other compulsory measures, which means water harvesting, water conservation, all of these would have to go hand in hand. So we can really extract the best climate related and tariff related benefits from using solar infrastructure. I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you very much for flagging few of the points and also making an interesting point that how even this being traded for urban water, from the solar. So, well, I think there is not time much to go it further, take it further on discussion. So I think next I'll request Dr. Anwar Zahid from Bangladesh to, I guess he has a couple of slides. So yes, Dr. Zahid.
Okay, good afternoon and good morning, everyone, once again. First of all, thank you very much for organizing such an interesting and useful webinar and inviting us to join here. I had also the same answer. It depends. And before going to answer the two questions, I would like to overview the situation. And obviously, it varies area to area. So if we consider Bangladesh, in Bangladesh, we have multi-layered alluvial aquifers mostly in delta and floodplain areas. And if we consider about 350 meters of the aquifer system, we have the irrigation zone in the upper shallow aquifer within the depth ranges up to 30 or 100 meters. And then in the deeper part, we have the zone for water supply. And though we have multi-layered aquifers, if you see this slide, in many parts, the aquitard exists within the aquifer system, and in many parts, not significant aquitards exist within the aquifer. That means we consider the whole the Bengal basin aquifer as one system. So where there is no aquitard, so changes of water quality or water storage from one zone may impact the other zone above or below. And that is important before going to the large scale abstraction of groundwater. So if we see the challenges, Bangladesh has already been suffering from water depletion, both in terms of water quality and quantity. Yeah. So the water level declining obviously is very high in Dhaka city and also in Barin area, northwest part of the country. For Dhaka city, obviously this is for the urban and industrial use, and in Barin area, that is mostly due to the irrigation abstraction. So in the graphs, you can see how the water table or water level is declining with time. So if you see the hydrographs from different parts of Bangladesh, these hydrographs are mainly based on the water table from the shallow aquifer, where we have the irrigation abstraction zone. So we have more or less identified 4 types of groundwater level declining trend. If you see the A type, so during dry irrigation period, water table is declining, and during monsoon, when the rain begins and the pump ceased, then water table regains its static position. And in these areas, even potential recharge is higher than the actual recharge. So if you abstract more water, you will get more recharge. But in many areas, with time, in one hand, water table fluctuation is increasing. On the other hand, there is a trend of lowering of water table permanently by few centimeters. And in C type, you see with time water table is increasing, but since recent years, due to mainly irrigation abstraction, the static water level is declining by centimeters. And if you see D type, in Dhaka city, I have mentioned due to the urban and industrial abstraction in and around the city, water table is declining tremendously, very alarmingly. And so on in the Barin northwest part, due to the irrigation abstraction, water table is declining alarmingly. So we have already under stress. And now if I consider the questions, so in Bangladesh, and also in many parts of the Southeast Asia, permanent and alarming declining trends of groundwater level is already observed. And this permanent declination ranges from few centimeters to 1 to 2 meters. In Dhaka city, you can say since last 50 years, water table or water level has declined more than 70 meters. Even in Barin area, due to irrigation abstraction, since last 40 years, water level has declined more than 35 to 40 meters. Okay, now we have got National Water Act and Water Rules in 2018. And in the water rules, district upozila, that means sub-district unit level committees has been formed, and the responsibility of these committees is to provide license. And how these committees will provide license? When one user, farmer or industrial user apply for a license, then the committee would analyze the situation of that area, considering the resource availability and demand for different uses, and also considering the priority for different uses. Then committee will decide whether the applicant would get license or not. So if we consider these rules and acts, okay, I should mention that these committees are yet to be operated. Okay, if it works properly, then if the committee allow anyone to install a tube well, considering all the data and information, then whether he use a diesel pump or electric pump or solar pump, that does not matter. If he gets the license, if he gets the permission, he can use the solar pump, and the solar energy obviously will reduce the pressure on the electric and diesel energy. And obviously in our national water policy, it is mentioned where surface water is available throughout the year for irrigation, surface water have to be used. So considering this, guideline of national water policy, farmer can abstract or withdraw surface water or river water using solar energy. And again, obviously here, we can reduce pressure on diesel and electric energy. And as we are suffering from water quality problems, you all know that our shallow groundwater is contaminated by arsenic in delta and floodplain areas. We have salinity problem in upper aquifers, also at intermediate depth down to 200, 250 meters in the coastal belt. So on those areas, the government has decided to preserve the deep groundwater only for potable use. So in those overstressed or water quality problematic areas, deep fresh groundwater should not be used for irrigation abstraction. So solar energy should not be subsidized or encouraged on those areas to abstract deep groundwater. And recently, we are observing a trend that many of the household users, they are replacing their suction mode hand tube wells with small diameter tube wells with submersible pump. So this is again a threat. We are already under stress on groundwater abstraction. Now, if these household level suction mode hand tube wells are replaced by solar or diesel or electric powered pumps, that might have a great impact on, again, the depletion of groundwater level. So considering all of these, now we are planning to go for water budget, Upazila or union level. So if we prepare water budget with allocation plan for different sectors and users, obviously considering usable water resource available for those areas, and also water demand for different sectors, including preservation of environment and ecosystem, then this can guide us for sustainable use of water and associated energy. So I think I can stop here, and thank you very much for your.
Thank you, Dr. Anwar Zahid. And I think then we'll, so with this, we come to the end of the panelists and this thing. And then now we have got maybe around 10 minutes for a general question from the audience. And also, please mention that to which speaker or panelist your question is directed to. And meanwhile, what I can do is that as there were certain things coming in the chat, I can start with which I'm seeing an interesting thing again, because we were towards the end talking about the Bangladesh. I see a question which is directed to Mainuddin. I know it's not in the Q&A, it is in the chat box. So since there's nothing in Q&A, so I'm just moving on to the chat box. I see now one coming into the Q&A also, so I'll just check up with that. Mainuddin, it is Dr. Zahid shows groundwater declining trend in northwest area. What could be the reason if cropping area has reached saturation, as you mentioned, or there are spatial differences or something else that you can infer to?
Yeah, I already mentioned that there are spatial differences. What Dr. Zahid shown, I have also shown in my maps that red dots in the Barind area, water level are declining. But the declining is not only related to cropping area. So it's reached the saturation already, but it is still declining. We can find that. The reason is that we have found many other reasons, like there is a significant decline in rainfall over the last 2 decades. There is no wetlands, there is no recharge areas. Due to rice cultivation for long period, there is a plough pen which is restricting the recharge into the wet season. There is a comprehensive research done by MIT paper on that. They use tracer to understand that. There is no flow in the river in the dry season. So there are a lot of base flow from the aquifer to the river. So there are a lot of other condition that is affecting the groundwater decline in that area. It is not only the boro rice which is being blamed for all this. So
yeah, Mainuddin, another connected thing which you mentioned about the plough pan.
Yeah.
Now, that normally when we are doing continuous conservation agriculture, zero till, that is a likely place situation when it happens. So, are they practicing a lot of CA practices here in this area?
In CA is being practiced in particularly for maize and wheat and other crops, not much for rice, particularly in the dry season. In the wet season, there may be. And there are some literature, they are saying that conservation agriculture root penetrates the plough pen and it helps recharge. It could be, but we really need to look at that carefully. We have studied the very last 20 years of ET by remote sensing. We could not find that significant increase in actual ET in that area. So however, we are seeing that significant decline in wet season, that is the groundwater. So we then look at the detailed water balance. We found that there are other reasons which is affecting recharge in that region. Okay, so it's not only the irrigation.
All right, thank you, Dr. Mainuddin. I think I see in a Q&A, Mary from IWMI has put one for this point. I presume that this is for Dr. Anwar Zahid, I guess. She says that did she understand well that the committees for licenses are not yet operational? If so, how the SIP licenses were provided so far? I guess perhaps it is directed to you, Dr. Anwar Zahid. That's what I presume. It is connected with your last slide.
Yeah. So, okay, the act is there, but the committees are yet to be operated. But till then, it is Water Resource Planning Organization where one has to apply for the permission. The Water Resource Planning Organization under the Ministry of Water Resources.
Okay, so anyway, now Aditi has added one question. So anyway, that on the rainfall trend, I think we'll have to look into this rainfall trend and we can see. Maybe now I can try and see if there are some other questions from the chat box. Meanwhile, as long as I'm not able to see the questions in the Q&A, but Aditi, you please alert me that till what time you want us to go. It's we already crossed 13 minutes.
Right, sir. Sir, it's up to you. Another few minutes, maybe.
Okay.
Depending on if there are some burning questions. So I have this curiosity from Tushaar mostly that do we know if the Gujarat utilities are still giving new electricity connection? Because that's one thing that they did in Punjab when we did the SMAP study with Mohinder earlier on. So even though they had very nicely were managing their electricity and all kind of controls, but they kept giving new and new electricity connection. So that's what I was curious. Is that something similar happening in Gujarat right now, or is not so?
No, I think in Gujarat they have basically discontinued giving new grid connections. Whenever there are pending applications, they offer farmers off-grid solar farmers, off-grid solar pumps to farmers. But I think issue of new grid connections has either been completely stopped or is very, very limited.
So I think there are no other, I don't see any fresh questions. And I remember that there were one from Peter, and perhaps that is also worth discussing, but perhaps maybe we'll park it for later. And now before we move further, there is a 1 minute pitch from each of the speaker and panelist. Just 1 minute, maybe if I can reduce it to half a minute, your final word, like a TV anchor asks, just half a minute pitch from each speaker. So I'll go in the same order, starting with Veena and then on to Meha and Mainuddin and Wolfgang and Tushaar.
Sorry, Veena had to leave. She had another engagement.
Okay, all right.
So
Okay.
yeah, we can start with
So
Veena.
Meha, any short pitch, half a minute?
I guess my big take-home message is that I really think we need to consider what the future impacts of climate change will be on groundwater depletion, because some preliminary work suggests that it could increase depletion more than current rates.
Yeah, I know that I have certain observations and things to talk to you on your presentation, but I know that as I was seeing in the Q&A, even Upali has mentioned something about that. So I think if you share a paper, then maybe I'll come back to you subsequently about this warming up, temperature increase and the groundwater depletion. I think that's something that, yeah, but right now there's no time talking to that. Thank you very much for that. So next, Dr. Mainuddin.
I just said that there are a lot of misconception about groundwater use and a lot of generalization. And I think this is dangerous. We need to, that Simi has mentioned, there are a lot of, it is complex and it varies all over the region. So we need to be very specific, and then what we are telling or what policy we are setting, that where it is applicable. Otherwise, it is there are a lot of generalization which are not true.
No, I agree with you, because particularly in the groundwater, generalization are very, very dangerous. So I know that, because so I do agree with you on that. But at the same time, then we'll have to come up very many area specific.
Not very many area, but we can. There are differences. Like recently, we have done an Eastern Gangetic study on the Eastern Gangetic Basin. The report will be published soon. So there are areas with distinct differences, let's say 6-7 areas that we can define. So it depends on how, as you said several times, the hydrogeology, cropping pattern, and many other things. Simi has articulated a lot of points.
Okay. Yes, Dr. Wolfgang, any short half-minute pitch?
For me, this was a very interesting and stimulating event. Thank you very much. I also like that there is very specific knowledge which pokes through the smoke screen of generalizations. I'm not so optimistic for the near future, but we look at climate change till the end of the century. Why don't we look at other things changing towards the end of the century? In China, for example, population will be half of now at the end of the century. And that will make problems much easier to solve. So that is where my optimism lies. Thank you.
All right. So thank you very much. And then Tushaar?
Well, I think that when it comes to groundwater governance, we are at a very crucial juncture. I think that that the manner in which the western half of India decides to promote solar pumps will, in the next 10 years, either solve a host of very critical problems or make them worse. So I think choosing the solar pump promotion strategy is it's a deja vu moment. I think its implications are going to be very similar to the implications of the decision in the 1980s to remove meters from tube wells.
Okay. All right. So Simi, final word. You are muted.
You are on mute.
Please unmute. Yeah.
I'm saying that in China, the populations may get half, but in South Asia, it's going to be much more than what it is now. So keeping that in mind, while solar energy is cheap and easy to install, so it kind of lulls us into feeling that this is a great solution to many problems. But I think I'd like to simply reiterate that we should not be lured by this, and we must understand that setting limits in a climate challenged world is going to be really important if we want to see or to get best benefits out of use of solar energy for irrigation and agriculture and for extracting groundwater. I shouldn't say extracting, let's say managing groundwater and governing it much better. Thank you.
Yes, Simi, yes, I do agree. Setting limit itself also is not that easy, yes, but it's required. But again, its implementation is going to be far more difficult rather than just not setting the limits. So anyway, I think that's a very debatable and that is required to be looked into, definitely.
Yeah.
So the last, but the very important one, pitch from Dr. Anwar Zahid.
Thank you once again. Yeah, I do agree with Dr. Mainuddin and many others that context-specific technologies we need to provide, and we need to explore, we need to do study. As we know that well spacing for the same capacity well is not the same in many parts. So that is one aspect. And as in Bangladesh or in, wherever groundwater is the main source of irrigation water, so we need a separate groundwater management act. So we are also trying to do that. And also from our ministry, recently we have initiated a separate individual groundwater management authority that is not exist in Bangladesh. So those type of institutional capacity building also will enhance the development of management of groundwater resources. And as Bangladesh is endowed with a good number of rivers, Water Board has listed 405 rivers. So if solar energy can be used to abstract surface water for irrigation, that may lead and reduce the stress on groundwater.
All right, thank you, Dr. Anwar. So with this, I thank all the speakers and the panelists. And now we have concluding remarks from none other than Divya, who is looking after this SDC from the SDC angle, this entire solar project. So Divya would kindly come in and tell us about summarize or situate the entire webinar series which we had, and today we are culminating with this webinar series of which we had this is the sixth one, as I said in the beginning. So over to Divya, and Divya will please sum it up for the entire webinar series. I know it's a kind of a difficult task for you, Divya, but I know you can do that.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sikka. I would never be so arrogant as to assume that I can summarize, the rich discussions that have taken place over the last 5 days, 6 seminars. But I just take this opportunity to thank everybody concerned, all the presenters, the panelists, as well as the IWMI team who has helped organize these 6 webinars over the last 5 days, and very successfully so. The series of this particular series organized by IWMI provided us an opportunity to explore the role of solar irrigation and how it can play a role in energy transition pathways, while at the same time ensuring that we are meeting the climate and sustainability challenges, especially in the 4 South Asian countries, where the project, solar project, or rather solar irrigation for agricultural resilience, is being implemented in partnership with IWMI, as well as many national and provincial agencies from the respective countries. The objective of this project is, of course, to contribute to climate resilient and socially inclusive agrarian livelihoods in these 4 countries, while looking at efforts to promote solar irrigation, of course, while ensuring the sustainable management of groundwater resources. This series, a part of this project is also to focus on capacity building as well as knowledge sharing, exchange, and this webinar series, which was organized, was first such series contributing to this particular objective of the project. Of course, this series began with a broad overview of the broader challenges in energy transition across South Asia and exploring the role of effective solar irrigation policies and programs, what role they can play. This was followed by 4 webinars focused on country-specific context and future prospects of national solar irrigation programs, including the various institutional models being used for promotion of these solar irrigation systems. Very rich discussions happened through these seminars. I was very, very impressed with number of models and, approaches being tested in different countries. I think more than 10 different cases or different ideas were talked about only in the case of India. I'm not even referring to other countries, what's happening there. So very interesting. And of course, the webinar today provided a very fitting culmination to the series by once again underlining the need to manage the solar irrigation programs and policies while ensuring avoiding groundwater overexploitation. So really thank everybody for their contributions. These webinars again reconfirm the opinion that the promotion of solar irrigation needs to be viewed not only as a means of pushing the renewable energy agenda or energy access agenda of the respective countries, especially in the agriculture sector, but should be seen equally as a water and agriculture sector intervention, which means that any policy or program developed for the promotion of solar irrigation pumps must take into account the wider water energy food nexus. I'm sure many of us appreciated the excellent presentations and the rich discussions during these webinars. And there were many times in the series of this webinars that when the allotted 2 hours seemed just to be too short to do justice to the rich debate. I mean, I can also take the example of the webinar today. I think we could very well have gone on for another couple of hours, perhaps discussing, the issues plaguing the groundwater and the role solar irrigation can potentially play here. I would like to thank once again, all the speakers and all the panelists for their very generous contributions. It is your highly valued interventions which have made this webinar series successful. I take this moment to also congratulate the IWMI team on successful organization of this series. I appreciate the considerable time and effort by the entire IWMI team for putting together this series. I also look forward to many other opportunities for us to take the discussion around the solar irrigation promotion forward during the course of the next 3 years of implementation of the solar project. Thank you so much. And once again, congratulations, IWMI.
Thank you very much, Divya, for nice and very good words, because I know that it wouldn't have been possible without the generous support from SDC and the constant support which we are really getting from you, Divya. And so I think at the outset, to begin with, and my vote of thanks, I'll start my vote of thanks thanking you and the SDC for all your support and also being with us all through this 6 seminars, webinars which we are having. So definitely, it's really, hats off to you. Now, I take this opportunity to thank all the speakers, all the panelists, and the audience who were there present with us throughout this webinar series. As we said, we started off on first and we are culminating it today with the 6th seminar series. And so our heartfelt thanks to all the speakers, panelists, and the audience, because without the audience, of course, it would not have been really possible at all. And not only the speakers for this particular webinar, but all the webinars which were there earlier. As I said, of course, our felt thanks to the SDC, and I would be failing in my duty if I really do not thank from bottom of my heart the IWMI team and the solar team particularly led by Aditi. And Aditi deserves a special thanks. And I know that how meticulously she has been engaged in doing this thing, and time and again having a series of meetings, because it's really not an easy task to do this kind of a 6-series webinar, and particularly when we are doing in a virtual mode. So I think I thank Aditi, all her team, all the country leads, all the country teams, because as you know that we are having this project in 4 countries. So all the country teams are worth congratulating and thanking from bottom of our heart. And at the same time, all the support which we have got from the IWMI headquarters, the Razi and others who are there with us in trying to give us this logistic support of organizing this event, because as you know, then in itself is a mammoth task. So I think with this, I thank one and all who were directly or indirectly involved in helping and organizing this series of webinar events, and all of you. And I'm sure that this has really given us a good amount of encouragement. And even in the next year, we will try and see that how best we can even make it more and more meaningful, because we know that this was we are going through a very trying and challenging time. And so we are in a virtual mode, and I hope next time when we meet, perhaps we'll be more, not virtual, but face-to-face. And so with these few words, I once again thank one and all. And of course, as I said, I'll again repeat, big thanks for my colleague Aditi and the team. Thank you all very much, and see you next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much. Thanks everyone.
Bye everybody. Goodbye.
Bye
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.